At 62 years old, Harold Turner thought his life was over. After giving 40 years to the railroad, he was fired without warning and sent home with a cardboard box. A week later, he spent his last dollar buying an abandoned train station everyone else wanted demolished. Most people thought he had finally lost his mind. The station was falling apart. The roof leaked. The windows were broken. The town had already forgotten it existed. But hidden behind a locked office door that hadn't been opened in nearly 50 years, Harold found a message left by a station master named Samuel Whitaker. 4 words that would change everything. Keep digging. Follow the records. What began as a retirement project soon uncovered a secret buried for generations. Missing property records, millions of dollars in forgotten land, a powerful corporation willing to hide the truth, and a mystery that had started half a century earlier when a station master suddenly disappeared without explanation. The deeper Harold dug, the more dangerous the investigation became. Anonymous warnings appeared. Strangers began watching the station. Lawsuits followed. Yet none of that compared to what he eventually discovered. Because the abandoned train station wasn't worthless at all. It was sitting on a forgotten fortune. And the people who stole it never expected a retired railroad worker to bring the truth back to life. Harold Turner arrived at the rail yard at 6:15 every morning. He had done so for nearly 40 years, long before most of the town woke up, long before the first commuters stepped onto train platforms with coffee in their hands. Harold would already be walking through the maintenance gates, carrying the same metal lunchbox he had owned for over 2 decades. The younger workers often joked that if someone wanted to set a clock, they only needed to watch Harold walk through the parking lot. He was never early enough to show off, and never late enough to attract attention. He simply appeared at the same time every day, as dependable as the sunrise. That morning felt no different. The air was cool. A thin layer of fog hung over the tracks. Somewhere in the distance, a locomotive horn echoed across the valley. Harold paused for a moment and listened. He had always loved that sound. Even after 40 years, it still reminded him of being 22 years old and stepping onto a rail platform for the first time. Back then, he had no idea what he wanted from life. He only knew he needed a job. The railroad gave him one. Somehow, 40 years had passed since then. "Morning, Harold." He turned toward the voice. A young mechanic named Tyler waved from across the yard. Harold smiled. "Morning." Tyler jogged over carrying a clipboard. At 24, he had been working there less than a year. "You still coming in on your day off tomorrow?" Harold laughed. "I don't have a day off tomorrow." "You're supposed to." "That's what they keep telling me." Tyler shook his hand. "You know, normal people retire eventually." Harold glanced toward the tracks. "Normal people get bored." Tyler laughed. The conversation lasted less than a minute before both men returned to work. That was how most days went. Small conversations, familiar faces, routine tasks. Harold preferred it that way. He had never wanted excitement. Excitement usually meant something had gone wrong. By 8 o'clock, he was helping inspect a series of freight cars. By 10, he was training 2 new employees on maintenance procedures. Around noon, he sat alone near the service building, eating a sandwich while watching trains move through the yard. It was an ordinary day. A good day. The kind of day he had experienced thousands of times. Looking back later, Harold would realize that was exactly why it hurt so much. The call came shortly after lunch. "Mr. Turner." Harold looked up from his paperwork. A woman from Human Resources stood nearby. She wasn't usually assigned to the rail yard. That alone felt strange. "Yes? Could you come with me?" Something in her voice made his stomach tighten. The walk to the administration building took less than 5 minutes. It felt much longer. Harold noticed several managers avoiding eye contact as he passed. He noticed doors closing, conversations stopping. By the time he entered the conference room, he already knew something was wrong. 3 people sat at the table: a human resources manager, a regional supervisor, a man Harold had never seen before. The stranger wore an expensive suit. Harold immediately disliked him. "Please, have a seat." Harold remained standing. "What's going on?" The man in the suit folded his hands. "Mr. Turner, as you know, the company has recently undergone restructuring." Harold almost laughed. He had heard those words before. Nobody ever used the word restructuring when something good was happening. 20 minutes later, it was over. 40 years reduced to a conversation shorter than a lunch break. The company was eliminating positions, budget reductions, operational efficiency, new management, corporate realignment. They used dozens of words. None changed the outcome. Harold was being fired, effective immediately. A folder slid across the table. Severance paperwork, retirement benefits, instructions for returning company property. Harold stared at it without speaking. The stranger in the expensive suit continued talking. Something about appreciation, loyalty, service. Harold stopped listening. Through the conference room window, he could see the rail yard. Men were working. Trains were moving. Life continued exactly as it had before. Except somehow, he no longer belonged there. "Do you have any questions?" the supervisor finally asked. Harold looked at him. They had worked together for nearly 15 years. The supervisor couldn't meet his eyes. "No." He picked up the folder, stood, walked to the door, then paused. 40 years. Nobody answered. Harold nodded once. "That's about what I expected." Then he left. The hardest part wasn't the meeting. The hardest part came afterward. Walking through the yard, clearing out his locker, saying goodbye. Some people didn't know what to say. Others tried too hard. Tyler found him near the maintenance shed. "They're serious." Harold nodded. "Yeah." The young mechanic stared in disbelief. "But you're Harold." Harold smiled faintly. "Apparently that's no longer enough." Tyler looked genuinely angry. "This place wouldn't function without you." "It functioned before me." Harold closed the locker door. "It'll function after me." But even he didn't believe it. By late afternoon, the news had spread across the yard. Workers stopped by one after another. Handshakes, stories, memories. Some lasted a few seconds, others several minutes. Each one made leaving harder. Shortly before 5, Harold carried a cardboard box toward his truck. Inside were 40 years of small things: photographs, coffee mugs, certificates nobody ever looked at, a pocket watch given to him by his father. The entire weight of a career fit inside a single box. He set it on the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel. For several minutes, he didn't start the engine. He simply stared at the rail yard. Trains continued arriving. Workers continued moving. Nothing looked different. Yet everything had changed. Eventually, he drove home. The house felt too quiet. Harold had been a widower for 7 years. His wife, Susan, had always filled the silence. After she passed away, he learned that empty rooms could sometimes feel larger than entire buildings. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, opened the severance packet. closed it again. The sun slowly disappeared outside the window. Around 7 that evening, his son Michael called. "Dad, hey, I heard." News traveled fast. "Yeah." A pause followed. "How are you doing?" Harold looked around the kitchen. "Not sure yet." Michael lived 3 states away. A good son, busy life, 2 children, mortgage, responsibilities. Harold understood. "Maybe this is a good thing," Michael said carefully. Harold smiled despite himself. "You sound exactly like your mother." "Someone has to." That earned a laugh. The conversation lasted nearly half an hour. It helped, a little. Afterward, Harold wandered into the living room. The television remained off. The house remained silent. He found himself standing beside a bookshelf where old photo albums were stored. Without really knowing why, he pulled one down. The album contained pictures from decades earlier: railroad picnics, company events, holiday gatherings. Then he found it. A photograph taken in 1984. A much younger Harold stood beside a small train station. The sign above the entrance read, "Red Valley Station." Harold stared at the image. He hadn't thought about that place in years. Red Valley had once been one of the busiest stations in the county. Then routes changed. Businesses moved away. Passenger numbers collapsed. Eventually, the station closed. Most people forgot it existed. Harold had started his career there. For nearly 5 years, he worked those platforms, learned the business, met lifelong friends, met Susan. Some of the happiest years of his life began at Red Valley Station. He turned the photograph over. A date was written on the back in Susan's handwriting, June 1984. Harold smiled sadly. Then he noticed something sticking out between the album pages. A folded newspaper clipping. Curious. He unfolded it. The article was recent, very recent. The headline immediately caught his attention. "County approves demolition of Red Valley Station." Harold read every word. The abandoned station would be demolished within months. Officials claimed restoration was too expensive. Nobody wanted the property. Nobody had expressed interest in purchasing it. Harold set the article down and stared out the window. Darkness had settled over the town. Somewhere far away, a train horn echoed through the night. The same sound he had loved for 40 years. Slowly, almost without realizing it, he looked back at the photograph of Red Valley Station. The old building stood proudly beneath a bright summer sky. For the first time all day, a thought entered his mind that had nothing to do with losing his job. What if the station didn't have to be demolished? Harold woke up at 6:15 the next morning. For a few seconds, everything felt normal. Then he remembered. There was no rail yard waiting for him, no maintenance schedule, no freight inspections, no morning coffee in the break room. 40 years of routine had disappeared in a single afternoon. He remained in bed staring at the ceiling. The silence felt wrong. Eventually, he got up anyway. Old habits were difficult to break. He brewed coffee, read part of the newspaper, looked out the kitchen window. The town seemed unchanged. Cars moved along Main Street. Children waited for school buses. Life continued. Harold wasn't sure how he felt about that. Around 9 o'clock, he found himself looking at the newspaper clipping again. Red Valley Station, scheduled for demolition. Nobody wanted it. Nobody cared. Yet the image of the old station refused to leave his mind. By 10, he was sitting in his truck, heading toward the outskirts of town. "Just looking," he muttered to himself. "That's all." The road leading to Red Valley had deteriorated over the years. Cracks split the pavement. Weeds pushed through the shoulders. Several businesses that once served travelers had long since closed. Harold passed a boarded-up diner, an abandoned gas station, a rusted motel sign hanging crooked beside the highway. The entire area felt frozen in another era. Then he saw the station. Red Valley Station stood alone beside the tracks exactly where he remembered. Smaller than before. Older. Tired. Time had not been kind to it. Paint peeled from the wooden walls. Several windows were broken. The platform sagged near one corner. Weeds covered much of the property. Yet beneath the decay, Harold still recognized the building he had once loved. He parked and climbed out. The morning breeze carried the scent of old wood and dry grass. For several moments, he simply stood there looking at the station. Memories appeared one after another. His first day, his first paycheck. The morning he met Susan when she missed a train and blamed him even though he wasn't responsible. He smiled despite himself. Back then, she had been furious. 3 years later, they got married. Funny how life worked. Harold approached the building slowly. The front doors were locked, but one side window had been boarded poorly. He walked around the structure. The station looked worse up close. Parts of the roof had begun to collapse. Several sections of siding needed replacement, yet the foundation appeared solid. That surprised him. Most abandoned buildings suffered from structural problems first. Red Valley Station seemed stubbornly determined to remain standing. "You planning to buy it?" Harold turned. An older man sat on a folding chair across the road. Harold recognized him immediately. Earl Benson, retired farmer, professional gossip. Earl knew everything about everyone. "Just looking." Earl laughed. "That's what everyone says before they do something stupid." Harold walked over. "How long have you been sitting there?" "Long enough to know nobody's visited this place in months." Earl pointed toward the station. "Ugly old thing, isn't it?" Harold looked back at the building. "I've seen worse." Earl studied him carefully. "You're actually considering it?" Harold shrugged. "Maybe." Earl laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. "Well, that's one way to spend retirement." Harold smiled. "You sound like my son." "Your son is probably smarter than both of us." The conversation continued for nearly half an hour. Most of it involved Earl explaining exactly why buying the station would be a terrible idea. The roof leaked. The wiring was outdated. The town wanted it gone. Nobody used that rail line anymore. Every argument made sense. Yet somehow Harold left feeling more interested than before. That afternoon, he visited the county office, mostly out of curiosity. At least, that's what he told himself. A woman named Diane greeted him from behind the front desk. Harold recognized her. They had attended high school together decades earlier. "Harold Turner?" she asked. "I haven't seen you in years." "I'm hard to get rid of." Diane laughed. "Depends who you ask." The comment hit closer to home than she realized. After a few minutes of catching up, Harold finally asked about Red Valley Station. Diane immediately raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Curious." "Nobody visits government offices because they're curious." Harold smiled. "Fair point." Diane disappeared into a back room and returned carrying several folders. She spread them across the counter. "The station has been sitting in county ownership for years. Nobody wanted the liability." Harold skimmed the paperwork. Taxes, maintenance costs, inspection reports, demolition estimates. Numbers filled every page. "How much?" he asked. Diane stared at him. "You're serious?" Harold didn't answer. Diane leaned back in her chair. Technically, she flipped through several pages. $1. Harold blinked. $1? The county board approved a symbolic sale program last year. If someone agrees to assume maintenance responsibilities, they can purchase certain abandoned properties for $1. Harold laughed softly. You're joking. I wish I were. Diane pointed at a stack of reports. Demolishing the station will cost taxpayers nearly $80,000. If somebody wants the headache instead, the county is happy to let them have it. Harold looked at the paperwork again. $1. It sounded ridiculous. The entire building cost less than a cup of coffee. Then again, the repairs would likely cost a fortune. Diane studied him. You're really thinking about this? Harold glanced out the window. Maybe. Why? The question lingered. Harold thought about it carefully. Finally, he shrugged. I don't know. Maybe because everybody wants it gone. Diane smiled. That's not a terrible reason. The next few days passed quickly. Harold visited the station repeatedly. Sometimes he spent hours there, sometimes only minutes. He measured rooms, examined walls, checked the roof. The more time he spent there, the more attached he became. Every corner contained memories. Every room reminded him of another chapter of his life. Meanwhile, everyone else thought he had lost his mind. His son called twice. Dad, be honest. I am. No. Really? Are you having some kind of retirement crisis? Harold laughed. I don't think so. You want to buy an abandoned train station? It's a historic train station. It's falling apart. That's just another way of saying it needs attention. Michael groaned. Mom would have encouraged this, wouldn't she? Harold smiled. Absolutely. That ended the argument. Susan had always supported impossible projects. A week later, Harold attended the county board meeting. The room contained fewer than 20 people. Most seemed surprised anyone had shown up at all. When the agenda reached Red Valley Station, Diane nodded toward him. Mr. Turner has submitted an offer. One board member adjusted his glasses. For $1? That's correct. Silence filled the room. Finally, another member shrugged. Works for me. Several others nodded. The vote took less than 30 seconds. 40 years earlier, Harold had begun his railroad career at Red Valley Station. Now he owned it. The entire transaction cost less than the sandwich he had eaten for lunch. As he exited the building, Earl Benson was waiting outside. Somehow he had already heard the news. You actually did it. Harold grinned. Looks that way. Earl stared at him for several seconds before shaking his hand. Well, what? This is either the dumbest thing you've ever done, Earl pointed toward the horizon, or the smartest. The following morning, Harold unlocked the station for the first time as its owner. Sunlight streamed through dusty windows. The interior smelled of old wood and forgotten years. Dust covered every surface. Pigeons scattered from the rafters as he entered. The waiting room looked exactly as he remembered, only abandoned. Benches remained where passengers had once sat. Old schedules still hung crooked on the walls. A ticket counter occupied the far end of the room. Harold spent hours simply exploring. Every room revealed something interesting. Forgotten tools, old signs, storage closets filled with decades of accumulated junk. Near sunset, he finally reached the far end of a narrow hallway he didn't remember from his younger days. 3 doors stood there. 2 opened easily. The third did not. Harold frowned. He tried the handle again, locked. Unlike the other rooms, this door appeared untouched. Dust covered the frame. Cobwebs stretched across the corners. An old brass plaque remained attached beside it. Harold brushed away decades of dirt. Slowly, the lettering emerged. Station Master Samuel Whitaker. The name meant nothing to him, yet something about the door immediately felt different. Every other room in the station had been emptied before closure. This one remained sealed. Harold examined the lock carefully. Old, rusted, untouched for years, maybe decades. As the evening sun faded through nearby windows, he found himself staring at the door longer than necessary. Then he noticed something else. A thin layer of dust covered the hallway floor. Except directly in front of the office, there, beneath years of dirt, faint marks crossed the wood. Scratches, as though someone had once tried repeatedly to force the door open. Harold straightened slowly. For the first time since buying the station, genuine curiosity stirred inside him. Because if the office contained nothing important, why had someone tried so hard to get inside? Harold barely slept that night. The locked office remained in his thoughts long after he left the station. It wasn't just the door. It was the scratches on the floor, the plaque, the fact that every other room had been emptied while that one remained sealed. None of it made sense. By 7 the next morning, he was already back at Red Valley Station carrying a toolbox, a flashlight, and enough coffee to last the entire day. The station greeted him with the same silence as before. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. Somewhere inside the walls, wood creaked softly as temperatures changed. Harold unlocked the front entrance and stepped inside. For a moment, he simply listened. 40 years around trains had taught him to notice sounds. The station sounded old, not dangerous, just old. He spent the first few hours working on practical things, cleaning debris, removing broken furniture, sweeping years of dirt from the waiting room. He told himself there was no rush to investigate the office, yet every time he passed the hallway, his eyes drifted toward the locked door. Around 10 o'clock, Earl Benson arrived carrying 2 coffees. "Thought I'd come check whether the roof had collapsed on you yet." Harold accepted the coffee. Disappointed? A little. Earl wandered around the station. "Place actually looks better." "That's because you've only seen one room." Earl laughed. Then he noticed Harold staring down the hallway. "What's down there?" Harold hesitated. "A locked office." Earl immediately became interested. "Now you're speaking my language." They walked together toward the far end of the building. Earl examined the brass plaque. Samuel Whitaker. The name seemed familiar to him. "You know him?" Harold asked. Earl frowned. "Maybe. Maybe not." "That's helpful. At my age, memory works like an old truck. Sometimes it starts, sometimes it doesn't." Harold shook his hand. Earl crouched near the lock. "You try opening it." "Not yet." "Why?" Harold looked surprised. "Because it's someone else's office?" Earl stared at him. "Harold." "What?" "You own the building." Harold considered that. "Still feels rude." Earl laughed so hard, he had to grab the wall for support. The 2 men spent nearly half an hour examining the door. The lock was old but sturdy, not something installed recently. Whoever locked it had intended for it to stay locked. Eventually, Earl left. Harold returned to cleaning. Around noon, he discovered several old filing cabinets behind the ticket counter. Most contained nothing useful. Old maintenance reports, employee schedules, shipping records. Yet one drawer held photographs. Hundreds of them. Employees standing beside trains, community events, holiday decorations. Harold sat on the floor flipping through the images one by one. The station had once been alive. Children smiled at the camera. Conductors posed proudly beside locomotives. Families gathered on platforms during celebrations. Then Harold stopped. One photograph caught his attention. It showed a man standing beside the station office. The image was faded, but the brass plaque remained visible. Samuel Whitaker. Harold turned the photograph over. Written on the back were 2 words: Station Master. That was all. He studied the man's face. Mid-50s, serious expression, neatly dressed. The kind of person who believed rules existed for a reason. Not particularly memorable. Yet somehow, Harold felt drawn to him. The photograph went into his pocket. By mid-afternoon, curiosity finally won. Harold returned to the office door carrying several tools. He examined the lock carefully. Rust coated the mechanism. Years of neglect had fused parts together. Picking it would be nearly impossible. Breaking it would be easy. Yet something stopped him. He didn't want to destroy the lock. Not yet. Instead, he began searching the station. If a key existed, it was probably somewhere nearby. The next few hours became a treasure hunt. Harold checked desk drawers, cabinets, storage closets, old maintenance rooms. He found dozens of keys. None fit. Some opened supply lockers, others belonged to long-removed equipment. One unlocked a bathroom nobody had used since the 1980s. But none opened Samuel Whitaker's office. As evening approached, frustration began replacing curiosity. Harold stood in the main waiting room drinking coffee and looking around. There had to be something he was missing. People rarely hid keys far away from the locks they opened. That thought stayed with him. Nearby hung an enormous wall clock, the same clock that had greeted passengers for decades. It hadn't worked in years. Harold had barely noticed it before. Now he found himself staring at it. Something seemed strange. The clock hung slightly crooked. Not much, just enough. Harold set down his coffee, walked toward it, reached up. The clock moved surprisingly easily. He frowned. Most wall fixtures that old were difficult to shift. This one wasn't. Carefully, he lifted it from its mounting bracket. A small metallic object immediately fell to the floor. Clink. Harold froze. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then he bent down. A key rested on the floorboards. Old brass, covered in dust, heavy enough to belong to an important lock. Harold picked it up slowly. His pulse quickened. It could be coincidence. It could belong to anything. Yet somehow, he already knew. 20 minutes later, he stood outside Samuel Whitaker's office. The key felt cold in his hand. The station seemed unusually quiet. Even the wind outside had faded. Harold inserted the key. It fit perfectly. He took a breath, turned it. The lock clicked, a sound nobody had heard in decades. Harold didn't open the door immediately. He simply stood there staring at the handle. 40 years, maybe 50, however long it had been, nobody had entered that room since Samuel Whitaker left. Finally, Harold pushed the door inward. Dust drifted through the air. The smell of old paper escaped first. Then darkness. The office remained exactly as someone had left it. A desk stood near the window. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Maps hung from wooden panels. Shelves overflowed with binders and documents. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing appeared stolen. It was as if Samuel Whitaker had stepped out for lunch and never returned. Harold entered slowly. Every surface wore a thick layer of dust, yet the room felt strangely preserved. Time had stopped here. His flashlight beam crossed the desk. A coffee mug still rested beside several folders. A coat hung behind the door. Even a calendar remained pinned to the wall. Harold approached carefully. The calendar displayed a date, October 1974. He stared at it. Nearly 50 years. 50 years since anyone touched this room. Then his light moved across the desk again. Something else caught his attention. A single sheet of paper sat directly in the center. Unlike everything else, it wasn't buried beneath dust. It looked almost intentional, as though someone had wanted it to be found. Harold stepped closer. Written across the top in fading blue ink were 6 words. If you're reading this, keep digging. Harold stared at the note for a long moment. If you're reading this, keep digging. The words were simple, yet they instantly transformed the office from an abandoned room into something else. A message, a warning, perhaps even an invitation. He carefully folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Then he continued exploring. The desk contained ordinary items at first: pens, maintenance reports, train schedules, employee evaluations. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained why the office had remained locked for nearly 50 years. The filing cabinets proved more interesting. Most drawers contained station records from the 1960s and early 1970s, freight shipments, passenger counts, repair logs. Harold spent nearly 2 hours examining documents. Several times he considered leaving, yet every time he prepared to stop, he found another detail pulling him deeper into the mystery. Shortly before sunset, he discovered a leather-bound journal hidden behind a row of binders. Dust covered the cover. The pages were yellow with age. On the inside cover, someone had written a name: Samuel Whitaker. Harold settled into an old chair and began reading. The earliest entries described ordinary station operations, train arrivals, weather conditions, equipment issues. Nothing remarkable. Then the tone gradually changed. Samuel began mentioning meetings, unusual visitors, concerns about property records. One entry particularly caught Harold's attention. June 12, 1974. Men from headquarters visited again. They wanted access to documents that do not belong to them. I refused. Harold reread the sentence. It stood out because no explanation followed. The next several pages returned to normal business. Yet a few weeks later, another entry appeared. July 3, 1974. Someone entered the archive room after hours. Nothing was taken. At least, not this time. Harold frowned. Archive room. He had not yet found any archive room. He made a mental note. By the time darkness arrived outside, he had only finished half the journal. He locked the office and headed home. That night, he sat at his kitchen table reading the remaining entries. Susan's old reading lamp illuminated the pages. The house felt less empty than usual. Samuel Whitaker's words somehow created company. As the journal approached October 1974, the entries became increasingly anxious. October 2nd. I have hidden copies in case the originals disappear. October 5th. They know I won't cooperate. October 8th. If something happens, the station must remain protected. Harold lowered the journal. The final entry was dated October 11th, 1974. The handwriting looked rushed. They came back tonight. I fear I have very little time left. Remember, the station owns more than people realize. Then the journal ended. No further entries, no explanation, nothing. Harold sat silently. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. A strange feeling settled over him. Not fear, curiosity. The kind that refuses to let go. The following morning, he visited the town library. Red Valley was a small community. The library occupied an old brick building near Main Street. Harold hadn't entered it in years. The smell of books greeted him immediately. Behind the front desk sat a woman in her early 30s arranging returned materials. She looked up as Harold entered. "Can I help you?" "Maybe." Harold approached. "I'm looking for information about a man named Samuel Whitaker." The woman paused. "That's specific." "I tend to be." She smiled. "I'm Emma Parker." Harold Turner. Recognition appeared instantly. "The train station guy." Harold sighed. "Apparently that's my reputation now." "Small town." Emma shrugged. "News travels." Within minutes, she was helping him search old newspaper archives. Emma turned out to be surprisingly enthusiastic. Every mystery was apparently an opportunity. By noon, they had uncovered several articles mentioning Samuel Whitaker. Most described community events, railroad celebrations, charity fundraisers. Then Emma stopped. "This one's strange." Harold leaned closer. The article was from October 1974. Station master missing. Harold felt his pulse quicken. According to the report, Samuel Whitaker had vanished unexpectedly. No signs of foul play, no witnesses, no explanation. Authorities believed he had simply left town. Harold frowned. "That doesn't fit." Emma looked up. "What?" Harold described the journal, the office, the final entries. Emma listened carefully. When he finished, she remained silent for several seconds. "You think he didn't leave voluntarily?" "I think something scared him." Emma leaned back thoughtfully. "Then why was the investigation closed?" Neither knew. Later that afternoon, Harold continued searching newspaper records. One article mentioned a farewell ceremony held after Samuel disappeared. Another described a replacement station master arriving from another city. Then something caught his eye. A small paragraph buried near the bottom of a page. Railroad headquarters announces property review. The article discussed company officials visiting Red Valley Station during the same period Samuel vanished. Harold immediately copied the article. Coincidence seemed increasingly unlikely. Around 3 o'clock, Earl Benson wandered into the library. Nobody knew why. Earl simply appeared wherever information existed. "There you are." He carried a coffee cup. "I've been looking for you." Harold glanced up. "Why?" Earl sat beside him. Memory started working again. Emma laughed. "That's rare." Earl ignored her. "Samuel Whitaker wasn't just station master." Harold straightened. "What do you mean?" Earl took a sip of coffee. "My father knew him." Suddenly, Harold had his full attention. "And?" Earl stared toward the window. "Dad always said Whitaker was obsessed with paperwork. Every document had 3 copies. Every transaction got recorded twice. Drove everybody crazy." "That's it." Earl shook his head. "No. A few weeks before he disappeared, Whitaker started asking questions about land ownership." Silence followed. Harold exchanged a glance with Emma. "What kind of questions?" Earl shrugged. "Nobody knew. Dad said he became convinced something was wrong with the station records." Harold immediately thought of the journal, the hidden copies, the visitors from headquarters, the warning. Emma leaned forward. "Did your father ever say what happened?" Earl nodded slowly. Just one thing. What? Earl lowered his voice. The night before Whitaker disappeared, somebody saw lights inside the station after midnight. Harold frowned. So? Earl looked directly at him. The lights came from the archive room. Silence settled across the table. Harold remembered the journal entry. Archive room. Suddenly, the missing room seemed much more important. Did anyone ever find it? He asked. Earl blinked. Find what? The archive room. Earl laughed. Nobody even knew where it was. The conversation ended shortly afterward, yet Harold couldn't stop thinking about it. Archive room. Hidden copies. Property records. Missing station master. By evening, he was back at Red Valley Station. The building stood silent beneath darkening skies. Harold unlocked the front entrance and stepped inside. His flashlight beam swept across the waiting room. Everything appeared unchanged. Yet now he viewed the station differently. Somewhere inside this building, Samuel Whitaker had hidden something important enough to risk his career, important enough to fear powerful people, important enough to leave messages nearly 50 years later. Harold walked slowly through the corridors, room by room, closet by closet, looking for anything unusual, anything overlooked. Nearly 2 hours passed before he noticed it. Behind a row of old filing cabinets in the office, part of the wall sounded hollow. He tapped again. The difference was unmistakable. Most walls produced a solid thud. This section echoed. Harold's heartbeat accelerated. He moved the nearest cabinet aside inch by inch. Dust filled the air. Cobwebs stretched between the furniture and wall. Then something appeared, a narrow outline hidden beneath decades of grime. Not a wall at all. A door. A door nobody had opened in decades. And just above the handle, barely visible beneath the dust, a small brass plaque read, Archive Room. For several seconds, Harold simply stared at the hidden door. The narrow brass plaque reflected his flashlight beam. Archive Room. After all these years, the room actually existed. Samuel Whitaker hadn't imagined it. The journal hadn't exaggerated. Somewhere beyond that door lay whatever secret had frightened a station master enough to leave warnings for strangers nearly 50 years in the future. Harold reached for the handle. Nothing happened. Locked. Of course. He almost laughed. Every important door in this station seemed determined to remain closed. This lock looked different from the one on Samuel's office. Newer. Stronger. Someone had replaced it at some point. That detail bothered him immediately. If the room had been abandoned since 1974, why install a newer lock? Harold examined it carefully. The metal showed less rust than anything nearby. Not recent, but certainly newer than the building around it. Someone had wanted this room secured long after Samuel disappeared. The realization lingered in his mind as he returned home that night. The next morning, he arrived carrying a flashlight, tools, and a growing sense of obsession. Retirement was supposed to involve fishing, maybe golf, not secret archive rooms hidden inside abandoned train stations. Yet here he was. The lock resisted for nearly an hour. Eventually, age won. With a sharp crack, part of the mechanism gave way. Harold pushed against the hidden door. It opened slowly. Dust drifted into the air. A stale smell escaped from the darkness beyond. Harold stepped inside. The room was much larger than expected. Shelves lined every wall. Boxes filled the corners. Filing cabinets stretched almost to the ceiling. Decades of forgotten records surrounded him. For a moment, he simply stood there. Then he realized something strange. Unlike the office, the archive room wasn't covered in thick dust. There was dust, certainly, but not 50 years' worth. Some shelves appeared cleaner than others. Certain boxes looked as though they had been moved. Harold frowned. Someone had entered this room after Samuel Whitaker disappeared. The thought immediately made him uneasy. He spent the morning exploring. Most records seemed ordinary. Property taxes, shipping manifests, construction permits, maintenance contracts. Yet Samuel's warnings echoed constantly in his mind. The station owns more than people realize. Somewhere in this room, there had to be a reason he wrote those words. Around noon, Harold discovered a section labeled Property Holdings. Hundreds of folders filled several cabinets. Many dated back decades. He carried a stack to an old table and began reading. Hours passed. Outside, sunlight shifted across dusty windows. Inside, Harold followed a trail of paperwork stretching back generations. Gradually, a picture emerged. Red Valley Station had never been just a station. Over the years, it acquired land, small parcels at first, storage yards, maintenance areas, access roads. Then larger properties, warehouses, freight facilities, agricultural lots. Most had been forgotten as railroad operations declined. Yet legally, many still belonged to the station itself. Harold sat back in his chair. The realization surprised him. The station possessed far more property than anyone seemed to realize. Then he noticed gaps. Entire folders were missing. Several index cards referenced documents that no longer existed. Property File 7A, missing. Property File 12C, missing. Property File 18B, missing. The pattern appeared intentional. Somebody hadn't forgotten these records. Somebody removed them. Late that afternoon, a vehicle pulled into the parking lot outside. Harold glanced through the window. Emma Parker stepped out, carrying a cardboard box. He smiled despite himself. "You brought supplies." Emma entered the station. "I brought sandwiches." Harold laughed. "You're officially my favorite librarian." She set the box down and examined the archive room. "Wow, that's what I said." Together, they spent the next hour reviewing documents. Emma proved surprisingly useful. She noticed details Harold missed: dates, cross-references, filing inconsistencies. At one point, she held up a map. "Look at this." Harold moved closer. The map showed railroad property from the early 1960s. Several sections had been highlighted in red. "What am I looking at?" Emma pointed toward a large area beyond the station. "This land isn't mentioned anywhere in the modern records." Harold studied it carefully. The highlighted section covered hundreds of acres, far more than he expected. "Could the map be wrong?" Emma shook her head. "Official survey stamp." Silence followed. Harold felt the first hint of genuine excitement. Not because of money. Not yet. Because the mystery was becoming real. Samuel Whitaker hadn't been paranoid. Something had been hidden. Before they could investigate further, another voice echoed through the station. "Hello." Earl Benson appeared moments later carrying 2 coffees and absolutely no invitation. "I figured somebody around here might be making discoveries." Emma rolled her eyes. "How do you always know where we are?" Earl smiled proudly. "Small-town superpower." The three spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing files. Earl contributed little to the paperwork, but plenty to local history. Every few minutes he remembered another story, another rumor, another forgotten detail. Then one memory changed everything. Wait. Earl frowned. I remember hearing about those warehouses. Harold looked up immediately. What warehouses? Earl pointed toward a map. The freight yards west of town. Emma blinked. Those belong to the railroad. Used to, Earl shrugged. At least that's what everybody thought. Harold's attention sharpened. What happened? Earl stared thoughtfully at the map. A company bought them years ago. Which company? Earl named the corporation. Harold froze. The name sounded familiar, very familiar. He stood slowly. That's impossible. Emma looked confused. What? Harold pointed toward the paperwork. The corporation Earl mentioned was the same company that eventually became the railroad corporation that fired him. Silence filled the archive room. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The implication was obvious. If the station originally owned the land, how did the corporation acquire it? More importantly, why were the property records missing? Emma broke the silence first. Maybe it was a legal transfer. Harold nodded slowly. Maybe. Yet none of them sounded convinced. Evening approached. Shadows lengthened across the station. Earl eventually left. Emma returned to the library. Harold remained behind. Alone once more among Samuel Whitaker's records, he continued searching until darkness settled outside. Near 8 o'clock, he found another journal entry tucked inside a property folder. Unlike the main journal, this page appeared hastily hidden. The handwriting matched Samuel's. They think removing the files will erase ownership. It won't. The survey records still exist. If someone finds this, follow the survey. Harold read the sentence twice, then a third time. Follow the survey. He immediately searched nearby boxes. Nearly an hour later, he located an old survey index. Most pages had yellowed with age. Many contained handwritten notes. Near the back, he found a reference number, Survey 47-B. Attached was a location, County Records Office. Harold smiled. For the first time, he knew exactly where to look next. He carefully packed the relevant documents into a box. Then he locked the archive room and headed toward the parking lot. The night air felt cool. The station stood quietly behind him. For the first time since buying it, Harold felt certain he was uncovering something significant. Then he stopped. His truck door was slightly open. Harold frowned. He was absolutely certain he had locked it. Slowly he approached. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing seemed damaged. Yet lying on the driver's seat was a folded piece of paper. Harold felt a chill run through him. He hadn't left that there. Someone else had. He opened the note carefully. The message contained only 4 words. Stop digging. Walk away. Harold stared at the handwriting. No signature. No explanation. Just a warning. For several moments, he stood alone beneath the station lights, holding the paper. Then he looked back toward the dark silhouette of Red Valley Station. Samuel Whitaker had received warnings too. Suddenly, the mystery no longer felt like ancient history. Someone knew what he was doing, and someone wanted him to stop. Harold did not sleep much that night. The note remained on his kitchen table beside Samuel Whitaker's journal. Stop digging. Walk away. 4 simple words. 4 words that should have frightened him. Strangely, they had the opposite effect. Whoever left the note had confirmed something important. The mystery was not dead. Someone still cared. Someone still had a reason to hide the truth after nearly 50 years. The next morning, Harold arrived at the county records office before it opened. The building occupied a faded brick structure near the courthouse. Most people only visit it when forced to. Harold found himself pacing near the entrance while waiting for the doors to unlock. At exactly 8 o'clock, a clerk named Margaret Holloway opened the front desk. She appeared to be in her late 60s and wore the expression of someone who had spent decades correcting mistakes made by other people. "Can I help you?" she asked. Harold handed her the survey reference number. "I'm looking for Survey 47-B. Margaret adjusted her glasses. "That's specific." "I'm learning that specificity helps." She studied the number. Then something unusual happened. Her expression changed. Only slightly. Most people would have missed it. Harold did not. "Is there a problem?" Margaret hesitated. "No." The answer came too quickly. She disappeared into the back room. Nearly 20 minutes passed before she returned carrying a large cardboard box. Dust covered the lid. "Nobody has requested these records in years." Harold thanked her and carried the box to a nearby research table. Inside were hundreds of documents, survey maps, boundary reports, land transfers, railroad assessments. At first, everything appeared normal. Then patterns began to emerge. Red Valley Station once controlled far more land than anyone realized. The station's property stretched beyond the tracks, beyond the warehouses, beyond the maintenance yards. Entire sections of undeveloped land appeared connected to the original station charter. Harold slowly unfolded a larger survey map. His eyes widened. The highlighted property covered nearly 300 acres. 300 acres. He checked again. The number remained the same. "That's impossible," he muttered. A voice nearby answered, "Actually, it's not." Harold looked up. A man in his 40s sat at another research table. He wore a suit but looked more comfortable in work boots. Several property maps lay spread before him. "Sorry," the stranger said. "I wasn't eavesdropping. You just sounded surprised." Harold laughed. "Fair enough." The man introduced himself as Daniel Ross, a local commercial developer. Over the next hour, the two men exchanged information. Daniel proved knowledgeable about land values throughout the county. Eventually, Harold showed him one of the surveys. Daniel stared at it for several seconds. Then he slowly leaned back in his chair. "Do you know what this is worth?" Harold shook his hand. Daniel pointed at several locations. 5 years ago, maybe nothing. Today, he tapped the map again. Millions. Silence settled between them. Harold wasn't sure how to react. The number sounded absurd. "Why?" Daniel pointed toward a newly marked highway corridor. "The county approved an industrial expansion project 2 years ago." Harold remembered reading something about that. "What does that have to do with this land?" Daniel smiled. "Everything." He explained that warehouses, logistics centers, and transportation hubs were rapidly expanding into the region. Land near rail access had become extremely valuable. Suddenly, those forgotten acres surrounding Red Valley Station looked very different. Harold stared at the map. Samuel Whitaker had known, somehow. Decades earlier, he had realized the station controlled assets far more important than anyone understood. The question remained, why were the records hidden? Around noon, Harold left the records office carrying copies of several surveys. As he crossed the parking lot, he noticed a black SUV parked across the street. Nothing unusual at first. Yet the driver appeared to be watching him. The moment Harold looked directly toward the vehicle, it pulled away. Maybe coincidence. Maybe not. By now, he no longer trusted coincidences. That afternoon, Emma joined him at the station. Together, they spread maps across the old station master's desk. The room looked increasingly alive. Boxes filled corners, documents covered tables, coffee cups appeared everywhere. The abandoned office had slowly transformed into an investigation headquarters. 300 acres? Emma asked. That's what the surveys show. She stared at the maps. How does an entire town forget 300 acres? Harold smiled. That's becoming my favorite question. They spent hours comparing records. Near sunset, Emma noticed something neither had seen before. Harold? What? She pointed toward a faded notation near the edge of one survey. Tiny handwriting. Easy to miss. Harold leaned closer. The note had been written by Samuel Whitaker himself. Original ownership remains with Station Trust, pending charter review. Harold frowned. Station Trust. Emma searched nearby files. Nothing. No trust documents, no charter review, no explanation. Another missing piece, another missing file. The pattern continued. Every path led toward something removed, something hidden. Around 6 o'clock, Earl Benson arrived carrying dinner. Nobody had asked him to. Earl simply considered himself part of the operation now. You two look terrible, he announced, which means you're making progress. Emma laughed. Harold accepted a sandwich. Earl wandered around, examining maps. Suddenly, he stopped. Wait a minute. Both turned toward him. Earl pointed toward a section of land near the western boundary. My grandfather used to talk about this area. Harold immediately became interested. What about it? Earl scratched his chin. There was supposed to be a freight yard there. Supposed to be. Never got built. Harold frowned. Why not? Earl shrugged. Nobody knew. Emma exchanged a glance with Harold. Another mystery. Another missing explanation. The evening continued. More documents, more questions, more pieces slowly connecting. Then, shortly before dark, Harold opened one final folder. Inside sat a yellowed envelope. Unlike everything else, it bore a handwritten warning across the front. To be opened only if necessary. Samuel Whitaker. The room fell silent. Harold carefully opened the envelope. A single letter rested inside. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he unfolded it. If you are reading this, then they succeeded in removing the records. The land belongs to the station, always has. The proof exists beyond these walls. They will claim otherwise. Do not believe them. Follow the charter. Find the original charter. Harold lowered the letter slowly. The original charter? Emma asked. Harold nodded. Samuel had left another clue, another trail to follow, yet before either could say more, a sound echoed outside. An engine. All three turned toward the window. Headlights swept across the station parking lot. A black SUV rolled slowly past the building. The same black SUV Harold had seen earlier outside the records office. The vehicle did not stop. It continued down the road and disappeared into the darkness. But it had been close enough for everyone to notice. Earl spoke first. Tell me that's a coincidence. Nobody answered, because for the first time since buying Red Valley Station, Harold was beginning to believe someone wasn't just watching the investigation. Someone was following it. Harold watched the taillights disappear into the darkness until they were completely gone. No one spoke for several seconds. The station felt different now. Smaller somehow, less abandoned, more occupied, as though invisible eyes had been watching from the shadows all along. Earl finally broke the silence. Well, Harold looked at him. Well, what? Earl pointed toward the road. Either somebody's interested in your investigation, he paused, or somebody's interested in you. Emma folded Samuel Whitaker's letter and slid it carefully back into the envelope. I preferred the version where we were just looking at old maps. Harold laughed quietly. Me too. Yet none of them truly believed the situation was harmless anymore. The next morning, Harold woke before sunrise. The station occupied his thoughts before his feet even touched the floor. The original charter. That was the next piece. Samuel Whitaker had left enough clues to make one thing clear. Everything depended on that document. If the station trust existed, the charter would prove it. If the charter survived, someone had failed to erase the truth. By 8 o'clock, Harold and Emma were sitting inside the county archives building. The facility occupied the basement of the courthouse. Unlike the records office, very few people visited. Metal shelves stretched endlessly beneath fluorescent lights. Boxes filled every corner. Dust covered nearly everything. The archivist, a thin man named Leonard Price, greeted them cautiously. You're looking for a railroad charter from the 1800s. Harold nodded. Leonard sighed. That narrows it down to several thousand documents. Emma smiled. We're optimistic. Leonard stared at her. You shouldn't be. Hours passed. One box after another. Old maps, property transfers, railroad agreements, town council records. Most proved useless. Yet Harold didn't mind. The search itself felt strangely familiar, like maintenance work years ago. One small task after another. Slow progress, steady progress. Around noon, Leonard returned carrying another stack of files. Try these. Harold thanked him. The box looked older than the others. Much older. Several documents dated back more than a century. As Harold carefully unfolded one brittle page, a name caught his attention. Red Valley Transportation Trust. He froze. Emma immediately noticed. What is it? Harold handed her the document. Both read silently. Then they read it again. The trust existed. Not only that, it had been created alongside the station itself. According to the charter, all surrounding land acquired for station operations would remain under trust ownership unless formally dissolved by unanimous board approval. Harold felt excitement building. That's it, Emma nodded. That's exactly what Samuel was talking about. Yet something still felt incomplete. Harold continued reading. Then his expression changed. Problem. Emma looked up. What? Harold pointed toward a section near the bottom. The trust required 3 signatures to dissolve ownership. 2 names appeared. The third signature line remained blank. Silence filled the table. Neither spoke for several seconds. Meaning? Emma asked. Harold smiled slowly. Meaning the trust was never legally dissolved. The implication hit immediately. If true, the property transfers decades later could be invalid. Every missing record suddenly made sense. Every warning, every removed file, every attempt to bury the station's ownership. Someone hadn't made a mistake. Someone had covered their tracks. The discovery should have felt victorious. Instead, Harold felt uneasy. Because if they were right, the people involved had powerful reasons to keep the secret hidden. Late that afternoon, Harold returned to Red Valley Station carrying copies of the charter. Earl arrived shortly afterward. Daniel Ross appeared as well. The old station office had begun attracting people like a magnet. Harold spread the documents across Samuel Whitaker's desk. Everyone leaned closer. Daniel read carefully. Then he slowly sat back in his chair. "Do you realize what this means?" Harold nodded. Daniel shook his head. "No, I mean really realize." He pointed toward the maps. "If ownership reverts to the station trust, we're not talking about one property." His finger moved across several highlighted sections. "We're talking warehouses, freight yards, development land, rail access." Earl whistled softly. "That's a lot of land." Daniel looked directly at Harold. "That's tens of millions of dollars." The room became very quiet. Harold stared at the maps. Tens of millions. The number felt unreal. A week ago, he had been a retired railroad worker trying to figure out what came next. Now he sat inside an abandoned station holding documents that could rewrite local history. Before anyone could continue, footsteps echoed from the hallway. All four turned. A man in a dark suit stood near the office entrance. Nobody recognized him. "Can I help you?" Harold asked. The stranger smiled politely. Too politely. "Mr. Turner?" Harold nodded. The man handed him an envelope. "This is for you." Then he turned and walked away. Just like that. No explanation, no introduction. By the time Harold reached the front door, the visitor was already gone. A black sedan disappeared down the road. Harold opened the envelope. Inside sat several pages prepared by a law firm. Daniel read them first. His expression darkened immediately. "What?" Emma asked. Daniel handed her the papers. "They're challenging his ownership." Harold took the documents. According to the filing, a subsidiary corporation connected to the railroad company claimed legal rights to Red Valley Station. They demanded immediate suspension of all restoration activities pending review. Earl stared in disbelief. "That was quick." Harold nodded slowly. Too quick. Almost as though they had been waiting. The realization settled heavily over the room. Someone knew exactly what they were finding. Someone was monitoring every step. That evening, the station felt different again. The mystery had crossed a line. This was no longer about forgotten history. It was becoming a fight. Harold sat alone after everyone left. Darkness filled the building. Samuel Whitaker's office remained illuminated by a single desk lamp. The same room where another man had spent months trying to protect the station. Harold looked around quietly. The desk, the maps, the records, the hidden archive room. Suddenly he understood Samuel better than ever before. The station wasn't just property. It was a promise, a responsibility, something worth protecting. His gaze settled on the original charter, then on the legal notice. Two documents, two very different futures. One represented the truth. The other represented the people trying to bury it. Harold smiled faintly. 40 years working for the railroad had taught him many things. One of them was persistence. Trains didn't stop because conditions became difficult. They kept moving. So would he. As he prepared to lock the office for the night, something slipped from between the pages of the original charter. A folded piece of paper. Harold frowned. He didn't remember seeing it before. Carefully, he unfolded it. Inside was a handwritten note. The handwriting belonged to Samuel Whitaker. "There is one witness still alive. Find Eleanor Graves." Harold stared at the name. Beneath it sat an address. The paper was dated October 1974, nearly 50 years old. Harold's pulse quickened. For the first time, Samuel Whitaker had not left a clue. He had left a person. And somewhere out there, an elderly woman named Eleanor Graves might know exactly what happened the night the station master disappeared. Harold left before sunrise the next morning. The address Samuel Whitaker had hidden for nearly 50 years led to a small town almost 2 hours away. The drive felt longer. His thoughts never stopped moving. Eleanor Graves, the last witness, the final clue, the person Samuel believed was important enough to mention decades after his own disappearance. By the time Harold arrived, the sun was already climbing above the trees. The address belonged to a modest white house surrounded by flower gardens. Nothing about it suggested secrets. Nothing about it suggested a mystery that had lasted half a century. Harold walked slowly to the front porch and knocked. Several moments passed before the door opened. An elderly woman stood before him. Her hair was completely white. Her movements were careful but steady. Her eyes, however, remained remarkably sharp. "Mrs. Graves?" Harold asked. The woman studied him for several seconds. Then her expression changed. "You're from the station." Harold froze. "How did you know?" A faint smile appeared. "Because eventually someone was always going to come." Silence settled between them. Harold suddenly understood. She had been waiting. Not every day, not every year, but somewhere deep inside, she had always expected this moment. Eleanor invited him inside. The living room felt warm and lived in. Family photographs covered the walls. A grandfather clock ticked quietly in the corner. Harold explained everything: the station, Samuel's journal, the archive room, the charter, the lawsuit. Eleanor listened without interruption. When he finished, she looked toward a nearby window. Samuel knew this day would come. Harold leaned forward. What happened to him? Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she spoke again, her voice sounded older, tired. Samuel didn't disappear. Harold felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Eleanor sighed. "He was forced out." Then the story began. In 1974, Eleanor had worked as a legal secretary for the railroad's regional office. She remembered Samuel Whitaker clearly. Honest, stubborn, difficult when necessary. The kind of man who refused to ignore something once he knew it was wrong. Months before his disappearance, Samuel discovered irregularities in the station trust records. Large sections of land were quietly being transferred away from station ownership. Some transfers lacked authorization. Others contained forged approvals. Samuel objected. Management ignored him. Samuel persisted. The situation escalated. Eventually, several executives visited Red Valley personally. According to Eleanor, those meetings became heated. Samuel refused to sign documents, refused to approve ownership changes, refused to stay quiet. Then one night, everything changed. Eleanor rose slowly and crossed the room. She opened an old wooden cabinet and removed a box. Inside rested several folders, carefully preserved, carefully hidden. Harold immediately recognized the handwriting on many pages. Samuel Whitaker. Eleanor returned to her chair. "He gave these to me." Harold stared at the documents. Why? Because he knew they were coming. The room fell silent. Eleanor explained that Samuel anticipated retaliation. He copied records, preserved evidence, hid documents. Then he entrusted part of the collection to her. Several days later, he resigned under pressure and left town permanently. Not because he had done anything wrong, because remaining would accomplish nothing. The railroad already controlled too much. Harold listened quietly. The truth felt both surprising and strangely familiar. Samuel had never vanished. He had sacrificed everything trying to protect the station. Eleanor handed over several documents. Among them was the missing board approval file, the crucial evidence. The third signature required to dissolve the trust had never existed. The transfer was invalid. The station trust remained legal. For decades, nobody realized the proof survived. Harold returned to Red Valley carrying more than evidence. He carried Samuel Whitaker's story. News spread quickly. The lawsuit moved forward. Local newspapers became interested, then regional media. Suddenly, people who had ignored Red Valley Station for years wanted interviews, wanted comments, wanted explanations. Harold hated every minute of it. Yet the attention helped. More documents surfaced. Former employees came forward. Retired railroad workers shared memories. Piece by piece, the full picture emerged. Samuel Whitaker had told the truth all along. Several months later, the courtroom filled with spectators. Harold sat quietly beside his attorney. Emma occupied the front row. Earl Benson somehow managed to sit everywhere at once. Even Michael flew in from out of state. For the first time in years, Harold felt nervous, not because of the property, not because of the money, because Samuel deserved justice. The hearing lasted most of the day. Lawyers argued, experts testified, documents were reviewed. Then Eleanor Graves took the stand. The courtroom became silent as she described events from 50 years earlier. She spoke clearly, confidently, truthfully. When she finished, nobody questioned her credibility. The judge spent nearly an hour reviewing evidence. Then came the decision. The station trust remained valid. Ownership belonged to Red Valley Station. All disputed property rights reverted accordingly. Harold closed his eyes briefly. Across the room, several corporate attorneys looked stunned. Emma squeezed his shoulder. Earl smiled so broadly it seemed physically impossible. Michael simply stared at his father with pride. The battle was finally over. Yet the most important moments came afterward. Months passed. Restoration continued. Investment followed. Warehouses reopened. Businesses returned. New jobs appeared. Construction crews arrived. For the first time in decades, people had reasons to visit Red Valley again. The abandoned station slowly transformed. Fresh paint replaced peeling boards. Broken windows disappeared. The platform returned to life. Tourists visited. Local families gathered. Children played where weeds once grew. Harold remained involved in every project, not because he needed the money. He didn't. The property settlement had secured his future many times over. He stayed because the station mattered. One autumn afternoon, nearly a year after finding Samuel's office, a special ceremony took place. Hundreds of people attended, town officials, former railroad workers, families, reporters. Harold stood near the station entrance looking across the crowd. Emma stood nearby. Earl occupied the front row despite having no official role whatsoever. Michael and his children sat together beneath a newly restored station sign. The mayor stepped forward first. Speeches followed. Applause echoed across the platform. Then Harold approached the podium. Public speaking had never been his strength. Yet somehow the words came easily. He spoke about history, community, persistence. He spoke about second chances. Most importantly, he spoke about Samuel Whitaker, the man who refused to surrender the truth, the man who protected the station when nobody else would. When Harold finished, the crowd rose to its feet. Not for him, for Samuel. Later that afternoon, Harold walked alone toward the station master's office. The room looked different now. restored, organized, alive. Yet he had preserved certain things exactly as they were. The desk remained. The lamp remained. Even the old plaque survived. Harold carefully lifted it from a shelf. Then he carried it into the hallway. Several workers watched curiously, without ceremony. Harold mounted the plaque beside the office door. Samuel Whitaker, station master. He stepped back and smiled. It felt right. As evening approached, a distant train horn echoed across the valley. Harold turned toward the tracks. A passenger train slowly approached the station. The first regular service route to stop at Red Valley in decades. People gathered along the platform. Children pointed excitedly. Cameras appeared. Laughter filled the air. The train rolled to a gentle stop. Doors opened. Passengers stepped onto the platform. Life returned. Real life. Harold stood quietly near the edge of the crowd. No speeches, no reporters, no cameras. Just a retired railroad worker watching a station come home. A year earlier, he had lost everything that gave structure to his life. 40 years of work ended with a cardboard box and a handshake. He thought it was the end of his story. Instead, it became the beginning of another. The setting sun cast long shadows across the platform. Somewhere above the restored station entrance hung a new sign, Red Valley Station. Beneath it stood people who once believed the place was forgotten forever. Harold smiled. Sometimes the things everyone abandons are the very things worth saving. And sometimes the last locked door leads exactly where you're supposed to be.